Philippians. I love Philippians. You know, every once in a while, you have a moment that you never forget. I had one of those moments about 15 years ago. It was when I finished graduate school. I had a chance to talk with George W. Bush, the President of the United States. Well, sort of. Actually, what happened was this. He was the commencement speaker for our graduation, and it was his first commencement speech as president. For the ceremony, all of the PhD candidates got to walk across the stage to get hooded by their advisors and then get their diplomas. While I was sitting during rehearsal, the man next to me, who's an older gentleman who was helping out with the rehearsal, told me that when I walked across the stage, he said, "You should say something to George Bush." And I said, "Well, I can't do that. He's the President of the United States." But he was insistent, and he said, "Well, when will you ever get another chance to do something like this?" And so finally, he convinced me to give it a try. One problem, though, is that with me is I was simply trying to get through the ceremony, much less try to think about something to say to the President of the United States. You see, I have this problem where I can only remember 3 instructions at one time. So, for example, if I'm driving, and fortunately I have a GPS now on my phone, but if someone gives me instructions and they say, "Okay, go down the street, turn right at the gas station, then turn left at the grocery store, and then turn right at the railroad," and then I'm like, "Stop, stop, stop, stop." Okay, that's it. I'll just ask for more directions when I get there. Okay? And so they had all these directions for me. They're like, "Okay, walk up to the stage, take your cap off your head, tuck your cap under your arm, walk across the stage, greet President of the United States, continue walking across, get diploma, and walk off stage." And I'm thinking that's too much for me to remember. I can't do that. And then of course I had the dilemma of what do you say to someone like the president? Well, what happened was by the time I actually got lined up to go to stage, he was actually getting a little bored because, the ceremonies sometimes go on a little long and there are a lot of names and everything, and he just started looking down and reading his program. And I was thinking "Oh no, he's not even going to see me," and so I'm just praying, "Please God, let him see me." Okay? And then I'm thinking why am I praying that? So anyway, so I get up there, and finally, as I'm walking across the stage, it's my turn. He does look up, and he peers at me over his reading glasses, and he sees me. And I say, "God bless you." And he says, "Congratulations." And I was so excited. The President of the United States talked to me. I was so excited that by the time I walked to the end of the stage and I'm in front of the university president, I'm shaking his hand, and suddenly I'm thinking he won't let go of my hand. And so I'm sitting here in front of 10,000 people, and it's actually being broadcast live on C-SPAN and everything. And he won't let go of my hand, and he's just looking at me, and I'm trying to get my hand away from him. I'm going like this, and I'm fighting him, but he's this big guy, and I can't get my hand away from him. I'm "What's going on?" And then finally, the hood goes over my head, and I went, "Oh, I completely forgot about my advisor." I almost walked off without him. And the whole thing about that, I was pretty appalled with myself because I just realized I was so starstruck about the president that I just completely lost my head, and I forgot, what I was really there for. In fact, the ceremony apparently was on the local news too, and a friend of mine saw it. And he said, "Wow, Michelle, you really ran across that stage. You left your advisor in the dust." And so I thought, okay, great, that's my impression. But it did make me think a little bit about this, that afterwards, I was a little bit disappointed that I had been so starstruck, and I thought, why didn't I just go with the first thought that I had when I first saw George Bush walk on the stage? And my first thought was, wow, he's just a man. He's just a man like, every one of us here. You see, we like to exalt people, don't we? We're awed by greatness, and I think we would also like to be great too. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to have ambition, whether it's to be a CEO someday, head of a nursing department, an award-winning filmmaker, etc. In fact, I'm looking forward to the first Biola grad who becomes President of the United States. I think that would be awesome, right? And when you get there, I'd be happy to say God bless you to you too. Okay? We should strive to be excellent. We should work unto the Lord, and we want to develop our talents and our gifts to use for Him and His kingdom. But it is important to remember that our accomplishments, our status, what we do in the world should not be where our identity comes from and what motivates us. We have a great temptation because our culture emphasizes status and moving up the ladder. We want to get a better job, more pay, a higher status, more privileges, a bigger house, a higher salary, a better title, and so on. And even in the Christian community, we are not immune to doing things in the same way. We expect that successful pastors will get a bigger church, professors will get promoted, missionaries will convert a lot of people. The assumption is, if you're doing well, you should move up. And then when you do, you also get to enjoy the privileges of your position. However, Philippians 2 deeply challenges this mindset. Paul says, beginning in verse 5, and I'm going to jump around a little bit here, he says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, although he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Now, what I'd like to do is take a little step back in time and look at it in its cultural context. Philippi, although it was in Greece, was a Roman colony and was very Roman in character. And one thing about the Romans is they had a very hierarchical society. What was important was your rank and where you stood in the order. For general status groups at the top, there were elites, the senators, the equestrians, the decurions, then the non-elites, the freeborn, those who were free but had been slaves, and then lastly, the slaves. The other point is that with rank comes privileges, particularly of power, authority, and status. And it was certainly expected that one would take full advantage of one's well-deserved privileges. You see, this was the Roman ladder of success. And the assumption would be that you had to go higher and claim the privileges of your position. But Jesus takes a different approach to the ladder of success. Many modern translations say that verse 6 should read that Jesus did not count equality with God as, quote, a thing to be grasped. That's how it's translated in the NASB, the ESV, and the NIV. However, most recent scholarship says that it actually should read something to be exploited. In other words, Paul is not simply implying that equality is something that Jesus is trying to grasp, that is, to attain equality of God, but that he already has it. And so rather than describing a goal, he's describing Jesus' attitude toward what he already has, that he doesn't want to use or exploit it for his own gain. It means that although Jesus is God, he doesn't prioritize using the privileges of high status like any good Roman would do. Instead, he willingly gives it up for our sake. Jesus moves down the ladder from being God to taking the form of a man to becoming a servant, or even more so a slave, since doulos should be translated slave, probably better than servant. In other words, in a culture in which status and honor meant everything, and people lived to climb the ladder and show they were better than everyone else, Jesus does the opposite. He climbs down the ladder of success. For a Roman, this kind of mindset would be unthinkable, even scandalous. As the Roman statesman Cicero states, rank must be preserved. It was important for the social order that everyone stayed in the place where they were supposed to stay. But this is what Jesus did, and it's also the mindset that Paul says the Philippians should also have. Think about what a contrast this is to our society today, which emphasizes getting our rights. We don't empty ourselves, we get what we deserve. We don't humble ourselves, we promote and present ourselves. who should have the most rights of anyone? Of course, the creator of the universe, God himself. But he doesn't insist on those, and he does the opposite and becomes someone who has no status instead. Not only does he become a slave, he dies a death reserved as a punishment for slaves and rebels against the state. He not only dies for us, but he dies in the most shameful way for someone of that time. You see, crucifixion was not just agonizing, it was a public humiliation, a sign of your weakness in the face of Rome's seemingly unmatchable might. It was a very public way of showing the futility of defying Rome. For example, in the 1st century BC, the Romans defeated a slave rebellion and crucified the slaves along the Appian Way, the famous Roman road. They crucified 6,000 slaves along a stretch of 125 miles. That's from here to Santa Barbara. Can you imagine what it would be like to be a traveler on that road, taking the long walk there and seeing slave after slave crucified for 125 miles? Do you think that would deter you from going against Rome? I think it would for me. In many ways, the cross is a public shaming. Like today, somewhat similar, there's a lot of attention given to the phenomenon of public shaming on social media, where people pile onto someone who has done something they think is offensive or otherwise unacceptable. Here's an article on CNN that said, "These days, it's not enough for someone who screwed up to be rebuked. Even an apology and remorse are not enough. On social media, Twitter especially, with its global reach and lack of irony, that person must be destroyed." I don't know, perhaps even some of you have experienced that. I'm sure we have all heard of that. People have lost jobs, they've gotten death threats, they've had to go into hiding, and so on. The goal of public shaming is complete humiliation and loss of reputation, and perhaps more. But Jesus endures an unjust humiliation and shame, even though he would be the person least deserving it. And he does it because, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:18 and 19, "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside." God has his own ways of doing things. And Jesus is countercultural in not being obsessed with himself and his rights in getting what he deserves, because he knows God has a better plan. Now, I have to admit that personally, I like to get what I think I deserve. When I get a promotion, I like getting that bigger paycheck. If I buy something, I expect to get my money's worth. If I've been waiting for a long time in line for something, I don't want someone to cut in front of me and get there ahead of me, especially on the freeway. You know, where like I'm waiting to get on the exit, and there's a long line of cars, and I'm just patient, and some person zooms in ahead of me and cuts in at the last minute. That drives me nuts. I don't know, does that drive you nuts? That drives me nuts, okay? So, an area of sanctification for me. So I think, why should I get less than I deserve? It's not fair to do that. So what goes through your mind when you get less than what you deserve, even what you rightfully deserve? I thought about this over a pretty trivial incident that happened a few weeks ago. It was my mother's birthday, and so I ordered her a present, fresh peaches from Colorado, which is famous for them. The company promised me that they would get them in time for my mother's birthday. My sister and brother were in town, and they were all looking forward to the peaches. Well, my mother's birthday came and went, and no peaches. And my brother and sister are going, "Where are the peaches?" Okay. A few days later, I called the company, and I said, "Where are my peaches?" And they said, "Oh, I guess we missed your order. Sorry, we'll go ahead and send them now." Well, I'm thinking, look, you guys guaranteed customer satisfaction, and they blew it, and I'm thinking, I deserve to have my money back in this. Especially since my budget was a little tight. I was actually a little like, hey, maybe I can get the peaches for free. Is this how God provides? Okay. But I guess I don't know if I should say I made the mistake of talking to my husband first about whether I should ask for my money back. In my mind, I had this whole list. I am justified in getting my money back. They didn't get them in time. They guaranteed it. It's my mom's birthday. You know what? I can help them learn better business principles. This is good customer relations. I'm actually doing them a favor. Okay? So I had a really good argument. In fact, in some ways, my husband agreed with me. He said, yes, you are within your rights to ask for your money back. But he does know that sometimes I have this thing where fairness and justice is really important to me. Just to kind of give you an idea, too, when my sister and I were little, my mom, sometimes she gave us a bag of Doritos, nacho cheese. They're awesome, right? And we would sit down and we would open the bag and we would evenly distribute the chips between us. One for you, one for me. One for you, one for me. Hey, you got one with more cheese. That's not fair. Okay? That's what we would do. That's how we were into fairness. So my husband says to me, yes, you are within your rights to ask for your money back. But then he said, you know what? Should you really do it? You know, people make mistakes. Do you want to focus on getting what you deserve every time someone makes a mistake? Would you want someone to do that to you every time you made a mistake? He said, maybe you should just let it go. And then, of course, he had to say this, well, go ahead and do what you want, but you really should do what's best for your soul. So I'm like, all right, thanks. Okay? As I said, last time I talked to you about something like this. So I wrote an email saying, don't worry about it. We all make mistakes. And then he offered to send my mother a free jar of jam. So she got a jar of jam out of it. You see, sometimes we have this overwhelming feeling of what would make the world right, and we have to do it. And we may be correct. There is something that would make a situation right, but sometimes there's something that would make the situation even more right. There can be a higher level of rightness. It's difficult, though, in a society which feeds us a constant barrage of messages about the self. And I don't mean simply being selfish. What I'm saying is also that society tells us that the self, what I deserve, is a standard of what is right and good and desirable. What's good is what's good for me. Now, to some extent, that might be true, but it has also become the overriding priority, I think, to where it crowds out other considerations like, what's good for other people, too? And what do we mean by good? I discovered something really cool the other day. And this is because I'm a bit of a slow adapter when it comes to technology. For the first time, I created and sent a text on my iPhone just by talking to it. Yeah, I did it. So, wow, I was very proud of myself, really. Okay. I said, Siri, send a text to my husband. And then I dictated the text. And then I wasn't sure what to do, so I said send after that. So she added send to my message. Okay. And then I discovered you don't have to do that. But anyways, the point is I found it all really, really exciting. You know, I could give her my message, and I don't have to go back and correct all my mistakes, and she does it right away. It was great. You see, Siri is what's called a human-centered productivity app, which means she's software that makes us more efficient by letting us get more done in less time. And she's part of a trend that has been growing for a while. That is, this move towards greater efficiency and productivity to the point where that has become our defining value. Now, you may ask, what's wrong with that? Certainly, it's beneficial to be productive, especially when you're in school, right? The potential problem, though, is the degree to which we make individual productivity and gain the measure of what is valuable over other possibilities. Let me give you an example. David Brooks, in his book, The Road to Character, writes about an interesting change in our society as a result of this focus on human potential. He says, the self is less likely to be seen as a seat of the soul. Instead, the self is a vessel of human capacity. The self is defined by its tasks and accomplishments. The self is about talent, not character. And then when we do just talk about character, he describes, it is used less to describe traits like selflessness, generosity, self-sacrifice, and other qualities that sometimes make worldly success less likely. It is instead used to define traits like self-control, grit, resilience, and tenacity. Certainly not bad, but interesting, they're qualities that focus on making worldly success more likely. In other words, they're not generally qualities that focus on what's good for others or the world in general. Our society, he says, wants you to assert and advertise yourself. It wants you to display and exaggerate your achievements. The achievement machine rewards you if you can demonstrate superiority. The result is that, of course, we are focused on what we can do and what we deserve because that's our measure of rightness. And to a certain degree, that's correct if our worldview is dominated by the need to achieve. But it's a hard way to live. You see, someday you will fail, and then you'll realize there's more to life than just focusing on yourself and your achievements. But there are other ways of looking at the same situation. There is a way that involves a larger vision of what gives life meaning, a different measure of rightness. Why was Jesus willing to climb down the ladder of success? The first point was simply obedience to accomplish God's will. The second, it was for the sake of others, for us. This point doesn't get noticed very much in the context of the passage. If you begin from verse 1, the literary context of the passage, it says this: "So if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus." You see, Jesus knew what was most important. A mindset which is willing to climb down the ladder is the one that makes it possible to truly care for others and not just yourself. Because sometimes in order to care for others, you have to take a loss. What matters is not just me, but how I impact others. Maybe the most important thing isn't getting what I think I deserve, but rather having a soul that is free from grasping and no longer desperate to make sure it gets what it deserves. A soul that can say, as Paul does in Philippians 4:11-13, "I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance, and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." This is the soul that finds the freedom to trust God to give me what I need, freedom to forgive others, the freedom to consider the needs of others instead of my own, to help create true community. You see, Christ redefines things and points us to real greatness defined by humility, obedience, and trust. And this way isn't a downer because, as we just saw, it leads to contentment. And it also doesn't mean that we just get kicked around by people and we just have to say, well, I don't matter, because Paul gives the kicker at the end. He ends the passage beginning verse 9, that as a result of Christ's humility, he says, "Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Paul talks about the greatness of Jesus being in his humility and trusting the Father and letting the Father raise him up and give him what he needed. He knew greatness is in following the Father and letting him decide when it's time to move up or down the ladder. You see, we need to do more than take control. We need to trust. Some of you may know who Erik Weihenmayer is. He became famous for climbing Mount Everest in 2001. Now, I would think that climbing Mount Everest is challenging enough, world's highest mountain. But his feat was even more noteworthy because he was the first person to do it who was blind. Now, if you can imagine trying to climb Mount Everest, try to imagine climbing it when you can't see. How did he do it? He couldn't do it alone. Of course, he had to have others who would help him navigate the mountain and help keep him safe. So he might have people go ahead of him and, for example, ring little bells to show him where they were. He's done other things too, like he's kayaked the Whitewater Rapids in the Grand Canyon, in the Colorado River. He had people follow him, giving him directions through a Bluetooth. In an interview with Success magazine, he was asked, how are you able to do this? How are you able to do this amazing feat of climbing Mount Everest when you can't see? He talked about the role of his team, and he said, I trusted the people who really mattered. Who are you trusting in? Are you trying to climb the ladder to gain your own identity? Are you trusting the one who really matters? At Biola, we want to impact the world for Jesus Christ. But don't run ahead of God. Learn to walk with him, learn to depend on him, serve with him, not just for him. Don't ignore the quieter forms of service, and don't pass up the importance of growing in godliness, patience, and wisdom. And don't neglect the importance of simply worshiping and following him.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.